Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's lecture by Nicholas Bohm, the Artistic and Executive Director of New York's Public Art Fund. I should note as we get started this afternoon that today's program is the last museum-sponsored lecture of the spring semester. We really want to thank everyone for their engagement with the museum throughout the semester and appreciate everyone's participation today, especially on a beautiful afternoon with exams and final papers on the immediate horizon, as well as a moment of so much division in the world. Nicholas's talk is entitled, Why Public Art Now? And I'm going to allow him to answer that question, though we also want to hear your thoughts and questions at the end of his prepared remarks. And we've set up microphones as we're recording today's talk. Please, if you have a question or a comment, please come up and use the microphones to ask your questions. While Nicholas will talk in greater detail about the history and the activities of the Public Art Fund, I want to note that it was founded in 1977 by Doris Friedman, a champion of public art who served as New York City's first Director of Cultural Affairs, President of the Municipal Art Society of New York, and was a tireless supporter of New York City's Percent for Art legislation. Since its inception, the Public Art Fund has presented more than 500 artist exhibitions and projects at sites throughout New York City's 5 boroughs. The fund also consults with leading cultural institutions, corporations, and civic organizations across the globe to bring strategic planning, curatorial, project management, and communications expertise to important public spaces. Recent collaborations in New York City have included artistic interventions in Moynihan Train Hall, as well as Terminal B at LaGuardia Airport. About our speaker, Nicholas Bohm has served in his current post at the Public Art Fund since 2009. A native of Australia, his curatorial career began there with Candor Art, public art projects, and later the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney. Moving to the United States, he served as the contemporary curator at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, before moving to Boston to join the Institute of Contemporary Art as its chief curator. He has curated literally dozens of exhibitions with a wide range of significant international artists, authored several major exhibition catalogs, and spoken and written widely about contemporary art and the role of the visual arts in a democratic society. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas Bohm.
Well, thank you so much, Frank, and thank you all for coming. I do, though, Frank, have to observe that it was a little tough of you to schedule this afternoon. I'm not referring to the beautiful weather outside. This is normally my nap time, so I hope that we can all stay awake at least for a little while and talk about public art, which actually is a subject I never tire of, and very happy to share some of what we've been doing in New York, and also really talk about, I think, some broader cultural trends that find a convergence around the idea of public art. One does hear, at least I hear quite often, the remark that we're sort of in a golden age for public art. I think that is true. Certainly, if you live in New York and many other major cities. But why is that? And thinking about that was sort of what led me to our subject today. And I hope the answer, well, really, I think there are multiple answers, because I think it really is about a convergence. And so I hope in presenting a range of different projects that we've undertaken, those threads, those themes that converge, will help to answer that question of why it is that public art is such a focus for so many artists, institutions, localities, and audiences. So, so let's get moving. I actually just to share the Public Art Fund mission. The Public Art Fund is it's been called Public Art Fund since it was founded in 1977. When I started and we did our first kind of strategic planning, I was thinking, well, is this really the right name for this organization? I mean, we're not public. We're a private, independent, not-for-profit, so we're not government funded. I mean, we get very small but appreciated grants, but probably less than 1% of our entire budget comes from government sources. And we're not a fund. So people can't apply to us. We go out to raise money to do what we do. But of course, we do public art, so in that sense, we stuck with the original title. I'm going to share, maybe just by way of introduction, a short video that just puts a little bit of that history and context together. Have I done this wrong? How do I go? Sorry, yeah. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
When we approach art in the public sphere, we're actually approaching a question. Why is this here? How does it shape my relationship to my everyday and to my community and to my notion of what's valuable and what's not in the world?
Public art opens up your world and your mind.
The one thing about public work is that people will see it from many different ways.
You're giving it to the public, and it becomes what they make it.
And hopefully, it then creates the urge to discuss that with someone.
For me, public art is very democratic, and it doesn't exclude people, and it doesn't cost anything.
When art is for everyone, it's not a commodity anymore. It becomes part of the city.
In that way, it makes the city feel more accessible and beautiful in a different way, too.
It's what gives us fuel for our fire to build and create and overcome.
That's what the Public Art Fund is about.
In 1977, my mother, Doris Friedman, founded the Public Art Fund. She had this idea that art shouldn't be contained within the confines of museums and galleries, but should be part of our daily lives. And everyone deserved access to art.
We also saw in the 1970s artists rethinking how to make work. They were not just making work that could be created in their studios, they were interacting with the fabric of the city itself. And Public Art Fund was a response that said we need to facilitate this burst of creativity.
Public Art Fund, for me, is a truly extraordinary organization. I don't think there's anything like it anywhere in the world. In this mission to bring public art, public participation, public engagement for free to a wide audience.
Doing public art is a real commitment. Public Art Fund actually is pretty fearless and completely committed to taking this on, kind of making the unimaginable possible.
When we look at the history of the Public Art Fund, there is a great commitment to, I would say, a deeper belief in what does art offer society.
I think they've redefined what public art can be. They've opened up a lot of space for playful curiosity and rigor and asking questions of society and of the public in the form of art.
One of the exciting things that we've seen happen in recent years is for public art to now be understood as really fundamental to any major civic undertaking. And people have looked to Public Art Fund as the leaders in our field to help them to achieve those goals.
Breaking down barriers of approaching art can help people feel a sense of civic pride and can make people feel like they have a place in the city too. The possibilities for our work are endless.
Everything that an artist can imagine are the kinds of things that we can share in public space. And in many ways, I feel like we're only getting started.
All right, so with that bit of background, I'd like to share some recent projects that we've done in New York and elsewhere, but perhaps beginning with something that is a very special project in many ways, not just because Pobel, I think, was an extraordinary artist, but very sadly, he died very recently, and so the work we did together feels all the more precious. I also thought he lived in Maine for many years, so some of you may have known him as well, and I think he taught at Bates. Yeah, and so when I first learned of his work, it was through some of the projects I think that he'd done here in Maine. And with Pobel, we did a project which was a crawl. And I think one of the answers to the why public art question is, of course, because artists want to do it. And as I kind of commented in that video, art over the past, 25 years or so has in many ways been about artists moving outside of the studio, making work in different ways. And one of those ways, a pretty fundamentally important one, is seeing the city itself as a canvas, seeing the city as a place to interact with, to reach audiences directly. And for Pobel, the idea of performance in public space. So he first, probably his most famous work are his crawls, which he did, first of all, in New York City, dressed in a Superman leotard, sort of lying on top of a skateboard and literally sort of crawling on his hands and knees up Broadway, the length of Broadway. Completely unofficial, no patronage of Public Art Fund or anyone else. And of course, the spectacle of seeing a fully grown black man crawling along the streets, of Broadway was a very powerful, disturbing image. So right away, I mean, we can start to unpack that on all kinds of different levels. But when we talked to Pobel, he agreed to do a project with us, and he agreed to do a crawl, but then taking, instead of him being this sort of solo figure, actually inviting applications from New Yorkers to all volunteer to participate And so we did a crawl that began in this sort of playground in the West Village, went sort of through the village, through Washington Square, and ended at Union Square. And there were 100 people, and they were drawn from all the boroughs of New York City and reflecting the diversity of New York City. And everyone had sort of specified outfits, and the whole project was called Conquest. And he was sort of always a master of irony, but that was sort of Popel getting people going. People wore gloves, people wore elbow pads, they were designed a special T-shirt, and this was, of course, officially sanctioned. There were disabled people, there were, there was a pregnant woman, there were really just a full spectrum of humanity participating, and tons of spectators, and then it all culminated with a sort of celebration at Union Square. So it was a kind of a wonderful moment where Popel's solitary crawl then translated into this public participatory kind of democratic expression of a personal conquest for everyone who participated, but still, of course, resonating with the same themes that his very first crawl, I think, had evoked. So a wonderful way that one cannot, I mean, there is no way for this project to have been anything other than a public art piece. So to that point of, public art is something that gives artists new ways of working. This is an exhibition called Black Atlantic that took place in Brooklyn Bridge Park. This is Brooklyn Bridge Park, and if you haven't had a chance to visit it, I think it's a really extraordinary new public park. I think it's sort of on the scale of imagination and accomplishment of Central Park, Brooklyn Bridge Park, designed by Michael van Valkenburg. A transformation of what was for so long a kind of disused post-industrial wasteland of abandoned piers along the Brooklyn waterfront, then through wonderful landscaping and brilliant ideas like creating a berm to block out the sound of the BQE, created this mixture of what they call active and passive landscape. The active being sporting facilities and more active kind of places, and then wonderful landscaped fields and meadows and gardens that folks can just relax, picnic, enjoy the sunset. There's bike paths, but it's an odd park because it's really a long sliver of land that then juts out periodically onto the old piers. So, anyway, for the last, I think, 13, 14 years, Public Art Fund, which is how old the park is, it's been done in phases, but it's sort of fully complete now. We've done an annual exhibition there. And the way Public Art Fund operates in our day-to-day program is with things like Popel, which is just a one-off project where the artist's concept drove what the format and location was. But then we also have a number of regular sites that we program every year. So Brooklyn Bridge Park is one of them. And this exhibition called Black Atlantic, this was a really interesting process where, I don't know if you're familiar with Hugh Hayden. He's a brilliant young black artist, grew up in Dallas, based in New York now, and we actually invited Hugh to do a solo exhibition in Brooklyn Bridge Park. And he thought about it, came back to us and said, listen, of course I want to do this, I'm thrilled and honored, but actually I'd like to do a group exhibition. I'd like to share this spotlight with other artists as well. And I've got an idea about, this exhibition that I'd like to develop. So together with Dan Palmer, who was our curator at the time, Hugh worked on this project called Black Atlantic, which seemed very appropriate to this location. I mean, really grew out of thinking about this location, which looks out onto the New York harbor and flows into the Atlantic, and thinking then about how the black diaspora, took people across the Atlantic and to present-day United States, but to the Americas and all around the world, and then thinking what commonality is there among artists of this sort of younger generation of black artists, that is there a common sort of language and interest. And for Hugh, there was something about creating objects that have a sort of a texture and a material quality to them. Hugh's own work, he's a sort of master carver, does incredible sort of wood carving pieces, and so that's something that's very important in his own practice. And this was the work he created, Gulfstream, which of course refers back to the amazing painting that hangs in the Met collection. And here, I don't know if you can see, but it's almost like this boat has washed up on the shore of Brooklyn Bridge Park, but inside is a skeletal structure. So it's like the rib cage, the backbone and a rib cage. So it becomes this kind of bodily boat. And all of those, the evocations of what that might signify for a boat that sort of transited the Atlantic. So, I think one of the answers to the question of why public art now is where we are in a moment of excavating histories and trying to understand so many of the currents, if you'll forgive the pun, that have created the communities and the collections of people that make up our present-day world. And art has shown itself to be a wonderful way to, through objects that are engaging and enticing and fascinating and beautiful and powerful, speak about those histories and those themes in ways that are very approachable and open-ended. And so I think Hugh's a part of a generation after Pobel, and taking some of these ideas in really wonderful new directions. Kian Williams created this work, Ruins of Empire. And this is a replica of the statue that's on the top of the US Capitol in Washington. And it was this, he sort of made it as this kind of earth-clad structure that seemed to be melting into the earth, and very sort of textured, again, going back to Hugh's idea about sort of this interest in surface and material and texture. among artists that are all, in some sense, a part of the Black diaspora. Oh, I was just going to say, if you go to the Whitney Biennial, which I recommend, Kian has a big piece on the balcony there that the curators mentioned they were inspired to invite him when they saw this work that we had in Brooklyn Bridge Park. Layla Barbaret, also sort of an incredible personal story, but sorry, it's a bit, actually the photo's a bit hard to get the detail given the back lighting and that they're black sculptures, but she does these incredible, both large-scale carved, totemic sort of figures like what's here, but they're dressed up. They, you know, and the jewelry and the ornamentation are all things like, you know, old bicycle parts and chains and things. And she began her art practice as a refugee from Uganda, living in New York. She'd been an out lesbian in Uganda, and that was not a safe thing to be. And she, you know, was able to come here to the US and ended up going to school at RISD, I think. And her art practice began just by sort of collecting materials on the streets of Harlem and then creating sculptures. And they are absolutely extraordinary. And she's also an amazing ceramicist, so she does incredible ceramic sculptures as well. Tao Lewis, who created these kinds of large iron medallions that were based on sort of ancient seabed motifs, and thinking again of sort of excavating from the depths of the Atlantic. And then sort of last one to show here, a bit more of a metaphorical kind of piece. Dozie Kanu created this sort of couch, but sitting on you know, like those kind of very elaborate car wheel hubs and spokes, with then a kind of bubbling jar of black fluid that kind of undulated and vibrated. And Dozie was interested in thinking about this idea of the Black Atlantic as being something that actually is an internal object, and that the couch, to evoke perhaps a Freudian couch, you know, it's the thing that's carried around inside, and the thing that then sort of continues to move us in ways that we don't even recognize. So, you know, just a wonderful group of artists really doing extraordinary work and resonating with each other, all at the invitation of Hugh Hayden. And of course, what a spectacular backdrop with, you know, Lower Manhattan right there. I think in the video also you would have seen, and by the way, all of those exhibitions like Black Atlantic, I mean, they're temporary. They're not permanent installations, and then those works, you know, go on to have other lives. But we also do consulting projects with other organizations that want to do public art, but that's not their sweet spot or its field of expertise. And so we were invited to work with Lincoln Center on the new David Geffen Hall, home for the New York Philharmonic. And so we partnered on the curatorial process with the Studio Museum in Harlem and Thelma Golden, and on the selection of artists, and then Public Art Fund also sort of carried through the implementation. And so there were two opportunities that we sort of found with the new building, and Nina Chanel Abney was the artist who did one of those, and it was to create this extraordinary, colossal installation on what no one had ever really thought of as a public art site, because this was essentially the back of the building. As you know, Lincoln Center turns its back on the surrounding area and faces inward. And when it was built, the area that it was built in was just seen as a sort of a blight on New York City, and was torn down to make way for Lincoln Center. And that area was called San Juan Hill. And so Nina researched the history of that area. It was a black and brown neighborhood. It had been home to a very diverse and interesting community. It had a very vibrant musical scene. So, of course, the irony of this performing arts center sort of being on this sort of, replacing this community. So Thelonious Monk and, all kinds of different cultural references, pioneering medical workers, nurses who, had lived there. Lots of different references built into also what just is sort of a wonderfully vibrant, celebratory tribute to this former community. And so I think another answer to the question of why public art now is that we want to tell these stories. Artists want to tell these stories. Institutions want to tell these stories. We as, communities are also interested in talking about who we are, and how better to do that than in public space, where everybody can participate and engage and share in this kind of experience. Just another view. And then inside the lobby is a 50-foot digital screen, and so another commission was to create a work for this digital screen. So we invited Jacolby Satterwhite, who's a really remarkable young video artist, to create a work. So eclectic dance to the music of time is his response, and what he did was actually go into the archive of the New York Philharmonic, which of course predates Lincoln Center, goes back to 1840, I think, and he found both the histories of sort of, I guess, those famous folks like Marian Anderson, but other people, female musicians, musicians of color, people in a field, because when we think of the great conductors of the past, century and more, it's typically white men. And so Jacolby was interested in sort of complicating that history, perhaps, rediscovering some of the stories that were overlooked. And at the same time, he invited 100 students from performing arts schools in New York right now to come and do their thing, play their instrument, dance, whatever it was. He filmed them all on green screen, and then he sort of created this animated video or world, digital world, that kind of walks through a kind of fantasy timeline from 1840 to now, and peppers in the sort of the performing art stars of the future, who are a much more diverse group than we're familiar with in the past. So it was sort of also just a beautiful way of expressing what Lincoln Center's aspirations are to try and open itself up to welcome people who have not historically felt welcomed into, these kind of bastions of high culture. So, really brilliant, brilliant project. Nicholas Galanin is a Native American artist based in Sitka, Alaska, and he created a really stunning work that we just recently de-installed, and this was also in Brooklyn Bridge Park, a sculpture called Land. Well, actually, the name of the sculpture is, in every language there is land. In cada lengua hay una tierra, excuse my pronunciation. And so I think he was interested in thinking about, giving the title in both English and Spanish, being the two colonial languages spoken in North America, introduced to North America, obviously North and South America. His perspective as an indigenous artist for whom the whole idea of borders is sort of inimical to the way ecology and the environment and living in harmony with the environment, should proceed, and that borders between people are also borders, between animals and between life forms, and that the way, he and his community would live are very different from that. And to make this sculpture, he wanted to talk about the border between the US and Mexico, which the material that made this sculpture is the exact same material. This is the border fencing on the US-Mexico border. So you see it's these kind of metal bars. The top panel is the sort of, is also on the wall. Like if you somehow manage to climb up, you can sort of slip down the top piece. He then evoked the Robert Indiana sculpture Love and exploded the form so that it's 30-foot high height, which echoes that of the border wall, is also matched with a sort of 15-foot depth that people could sort of walk inside of and walk around, as you can see, and kind of take possession of the sculpture in a different way. It just, so really, created this wonderful silhouette, but also very dynamic sculpture that was very experiential, and at the same time invited people to think about, what land is, what land means, how do you see yourself in relationship to that, and what's your land, what land do you belong to? All of those ideas which feel so timely in so many respects, and bring some of that indigenous knowledge into the public sphere. So seeing public space as being a place for artists to contribute is another aspect of why public art now. And also, we do programming along with a lot of exhibitions, and we're fortunate to have Pulitzer Prize winning musician Raven Chacon and Laura Ortman perform. And again in Brooklyn Bridge Park, I've got a lot of Brooklyn Bridge Park examples. I do love it. But also this is the exhibition that we just opened, and it's a stunning show called before the end. And Huma is Pakistani-born, US-based artist who's created this kind of series of 4 monumental bronze sculptures that incorporate sort of skeletal fragments cast in bronze, though the patinas and the painting make them, are just really remarkable. There's also a horseshoe crab sort of head, but they of course start to look like these, so they're somewhere between ancient, unearthed, tomb-like figures and aliens who've, just arrived from some other galaxy. Okay, so let me show a little bit more also about the Lincoln Center projects I showed are temporary, and that's going to be a rotating program. But we've also been working with sort of large-scale infrastructure development projects like airports and train stations, and I want to just quickly touch on that because I think there's something really important here as well. And the way public art, and this is Sarah Z, extraordinary New York-based artist. If you've been to LaGuardia's new Terminal B, you've probably seen Sarah's wonderful sculpture hanging here. On the right-hand side, Laura Owen's extraordinary sort of tile mural. And Public Art Fund did the art program for this new terminal. These are all permanent installations. And I think this was even, Rick Cotton, the head of the Port Authority, said to me that this was a revelation to him. What these artists were able to do, not simply to decorate and make more appealing, an airport, which, let's face it, we're in airports all around the world. They're all very similar structures. They can be very generic. It can be very anonymous. It can feel like a part of just the kind of multiplication of these interstitial spaces. But how do we make these kinds of spaces into civic spaces, into spaces that we are proud of, that we feel say something about who we are, that say that art and creativity is important, that access to those things is important, and that this is a part of the excitement of New York City, is it's a city of art and culture. And what better way to do that than, having it be part of your first experience if you're an arriving passenger. So it's sort of about creating spirit of place, all of these works, and everything we do tends to be very site responsive. It's really about giving an artist the opportunity to say, here's a location, how would you respond? Do you have an idea for this site that you'd like to share with us? And Laura, again, took sort of icons of New York City, some very obvious, some very sort of whimsical and offbeat, and and tied in references to art history, to the history of murals in New York, which of course goes back to WPA and lots of other things. And it's just a wonderful, affectionate tribute to New York City, but not in a way that becomes like cliches of photographs of the Statue of Liberty and the usual thing that people would just kind of resort to. And Sabina Hornig, who took photographs, 1,000+ photographs of the view of Manhattan from Queens, and then created this kind of extraordinary, it's almost like a stained glass window. It's all applied to the glass, but and then quotes from Fiorello LaGuardia that still feel very fresh and pertinent. So creating that spirit of place. All right, I've already been talking for a long time. So I shall wrap up, but just quickly, Moynihan Train Hall, the Penn Station edition. Here's Elmgreen and Dragset's work. That both of these projects, by the way, opened during the pandemic. So they were kind of very exciting ways to think that, you know, actually there's a future for cities and spaces to be together in. Kehinde Wiley did his first sort of stained glass ceiling, which is this wonderful backlit Tiepolo-like celebration of breakdancing, which of course is something that is indigenous to New York City, or invented in New York City. And Stan Douglas, the great Canadian artist who used CGI modeling to recreate the original Penn Station, the destruction of which really was crucial in starting the preservation movement in New York City and beyond. And then he researched the history and photographed different moments of that had gotten attention in the papers at the time, but that might be forgotten now, like when there was a snowstorm and a Broadway burlesque troupe was stranded overnight, so they put on a show. Or the bob-tailed bandit, a woman who was a bank robber who evaded the police and then was finally captured in Florida and brought back. And Angelo Herndon, the first African-American labor leader who'd been imprisoned and then was brought back to New York City, and you know, his union comrades welcoming him back. And finally, just to think about the way we can bring public art into people's daily lives. We have this wonderful partnership with JCDecaux and the bus shelters that they operate the advertising, and they twice a year give us the advertising space in New York, in Boston, and Chicago. And so this was a recent exhibition, Felipe Baeza, who was brought to the United States from Mexico as a child, so grew up as a kind of undocumented alien and sort of under DACA, and still, you know, is in that position, and mines the historic imagery of Mesoamerican culture, has, you know, drawn on museum collections in New York, Chicago, and Boston to create these extraordinary images that then proliferated all over those three cities. So, I've covered a lot of ground, and I hope given you some sense of why I think this is a golden age and a wonderful moment for public art. But of course, love to open it up in the few minutes we have left if anyone would like to ask a question.
Ask people to come up and use the microphones if you have questions or comments. Can you talk to us a little bit about your thoughts in terms of golden age for public art and where that might be going in the in sort of this AI world that we're entering, where communication will be happening more with machines and less between humans on a daily basis. At least I sort of see it happening in my world. And the role of like bringing art into communities and how you sort of see that evolving.
Yeah. Thank you, Nat. It's a dizzying moment to be alive, I think. You know, I feel like I have no idea how all these technologies are going to change the world, other than that they clearly are and that it's happening. But what I do know is that what we share in public space, it remains precious. I mean, just being here on campus today, seeing the quad full of people, I mean, there's a reason that everyone gathers there. It's community. It's the sharing of that space and that experience and that moment in time. And so when we might all be very fragmented in where we're receiving our news and our information and our entertainment, and be very, very fragmented in those ways, but we still have our public sphere that's a shared space. And so it does seem to me that public art can play a really important role, as I think some of these examples show, of being spaces that we can talk about themes and issues that have an urgency to them, that have a cultural resonance and a topicality to them. And I have to believe that sort of the richness of that experience, that it's something that can be a collective experience, something that can be a thought-provoking experience, something, I often see people striking up a conversation around our works, in public space. So, who knows what those impacts will be, but I do think that the actual experience of collective public space is going to remain and perhaps just grow in its importance.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you hold the space for critique or dissent, especially since these installations are put in, as you just described, such a shared space, a space that represents community. Once they're installed, how does dialogue unfold from there?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, there are clearly a lot of parameters around whatever gets placed in public space. Some of them are very practical. Is this dangerous? Could people hurt themselves? Is this going to stand up? There's just those kind of practical things. There's also, the limitations on violence, sexuality, the kinds of having things in public space. And we sort of bump up against those from time to time, depending on the artist. I mean, I think for an artist to want to work with us, they also understand that they need to be prepared to take on that challenge. I think it's mostly a very generative process for artists for that very reason, because any artist that's used to having a gallery show or museum show needs to rethink how they work if they're going to do a public art project. The materiality of it, the conceptual approach, how to translate their language in a way that remains authentic, but then doesn't, go over the edge into that area. But, we have had artists, particularly in the bus shelter series, because that enables us to work with photographers and painters and 2D artists. And, we've had queer artists in the exhibition right now, Clifford Prince King's wonderful exhibition. There's two black men